probably should do that. So I'm Katie, and I'm volunteering for Haddstock and helping to pull together the literary strand. So Daniel, do you want to go next and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yep, I'm Daniel Allison. I'm originally from East Lothian. I'm an author and oral storyteller. So I write retellings of myths and legends, mainly Celtic, Scottish, Irish, and I also write fantasy, young adult fantasy that draws heavily on Scottish folklore, myths and legends.
Philippa?
Yeah, I'm Philippa East. I grew up in Haddington. I now live in Lincolnshire. I have my debut, oops, turn it around the right way, Little White Lies, which came out in February of this year with HarperCollins. So I'm kind of at the start of my writing, well, in some ways at the start of my published writing career, although probably like most of us, I've been writing for about a decade. So, yeah.
Stephen?
Yes, I'm Stephen Barnaby, and I actually grew up in Thurso, as you can tell from my strong Caithness accent. But I do 50-word stories mostly, sort of write and perform 50-word stories, which are kind of sort of comic, I suppose. They're kind of extended one-line gags generally, with often a bit of a surreal twist. And a couple of pamphlets of them there. There we go. Self-loathing ostrich tragedy, and it was happy hour at the Nutty Nun. There you go, with all the tact and sensitivity of a experienced mental health support worker. Great, I chose that title. So I do. So yeah, so that's mainly what I've done. That's what I was going to be doing at Haddstock. I do write other stuff as well. I do kind of write other sort of longer short stories, and one day I'll write a novel. But yeah, so that's mainly what I do. It'll be a long day.
What do you most like about writing short stories? Because I spent quite a long time writing short stories before I had a go with a novel, and I think it's a great fiction form. I was curious, like, what you like most about doing short fiction.
It doesn't take very long. Because I am in awe of novelists. I'm in awe of anyone who can write a novel, and I have been sort of kind of attempting to write one, but how you plot and I'm fascinated to know how. I think Daniel, you've also written a novel as well, haven't you? I think or two. And so yeah, it fascinates me that people write novels and how they do it, and how they go about it. They plot it out beforehand, or I know like Muriel Spark, for instance, just like made her novels up as she went along. But but whether you, anyway, I should answer the question myself first. So anyway, short stories. Yeah, I find it very hard to sustain things very, very, very long to a degree. The very short things, the 50-word stories, as I say, they're usually a bit like sort of surreal jokes, really. And actual short stories I write tend to be sort of fictionalized autobiography, because I'm not great at coming up with actual plots and characters and things for a novel. So I'm fascinated to know how other people do that, actually, how you come up with plots and characters and stuff, and make them believable and sustain them and that kind of thing. So so I'd be fascinated to hear from yourself about that, how you go about, how you went about writing your novel, really.
With difficulty. I think I don't know if you feel the same, Daniel, but I think writing a novel is really hard. I mean, writing generally is hard. Getting a short story or a sort of flash fiction piece to work is hard, but I think writing a novel is like running a marathon. It's like really easy to just not make it to the finish line. And I think a bit like what you're saying, Stephen, I think there's so many things to get right in a novel. You've got to come up with dozens of ideas to make a whole plot, that covers 90,000 words. You've got to have a whole cast of characters. You've got to get the pacing right. So I think I would say that it starts with having an idea that's big enough for a novel. Like I think some ideas suit short stories really well, and then you need a different kind of idea for a novel. And for me to actually get a draft, I have to be super, super disciplined. And what I mean by that is I set myself a word target per day, and I just do those words every day until I've got a draft. Yeah, it's a bit like a marathon. Like if you keep, sorry.
So I was going to ask you, did you kind of minutely plot it all out beforehand? So you knew when you sat down to write your allotment of words every day, you kind of knew exactly what you were going to be writing that day?
With the first one, with Little White Lies, I had no freaking clue where I was going with the story. So the premise is that a missing child is found alive 7 years after she's been abducted, and the story starts with her coming home. So that's the kind of the beginning of the book, that's the springboard, but I didn't really have a clue what was going to happen after that. So I wrote a lot of words without knowing anything. Now in working on my second and third, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, carry on.
I was just going to say, working on my second and third books, I do try and have some sense of the overall story structure, even if it's going to change, but I try and have a sense of kind of what events will happen in the first act, second act, third act. So at least I've got some destinations to aim for. But it does tend to change a lot. I do a huge amount of rewriting. Most of my books are going through at least 10 drafts. So yeah, what about you, Daniel? How does it work for you?
Yeah, I would just say to begin with, when we talk about the whole thing of like, how could you create something of that size? And yeah, that when you look at a novel from a distance, it's incredible. Like, how could someone create all that? Then on the other hand, we all dream every night. We all come up with all these crazy stories every night, and some, they don't make sense, but somehow they do, because our brains do have this natural instinct to pull things together and thread things together and make a story, and lots of strange stuff. When we see things happening in the world, we want to put it together into a story, don't we? So I think we all have that capacity in our minds to write a novel every night, probably. But it's just finding ways to tap into that and finding ways to sustain it. And like Philippa, it's I would say it's all about discipline. It's all about just sitting down there every day and getting something down. And it's the imagination is a muscle, so that the more you practice doing this, the more you practice accessing your reservoir of ideas and images and whatever else is there, it just comes more naturally until you get to the point where it tends to flow quite easily. I'm also like Philippa, I like to have a roadmap in place, and I may diverge from that, and I probably will, and I want to. I think that's healthy because it's coming alive as I write, but it gives me a sense of structure. It gives you a certain sense of security. It starts off like early chapters, I know exactly what's happening pretty much. The plan is almost a draft in itself, but it gets vaguer and vaguer, and then at the end, it's like perhaps there's a big battle, these guys win. I think that's about as detailed.
Yeah, just put like placeholders like showdown scene. I don't know what's going to happen or where it's going to happen, but yeah.
How do you do that thing, like you were saying, Philippa, when you're writing, even in short fiction? In some ways, I think in short fiction it could be more difficult, because what you're giving is like an impression of a world, enough of an impression for the reader to buy in and kind of create the rest of it themselves. And as a novelist, obviously you have to fill that out and make it something that will carry somebody along. How do you go about that? Is that a very research heavy process? Is that more of is that feeling it out? Is it what is each of your kind of approaches to building the world around?
I think that's a really nice question. It's like, how do you create a whole world that feels real and believable to your reader? And I think for me, sometimes things come quite naturally. So sometimes it's like the characters and their lives will appear quite organically in my head. It's almost like I'm just listening or watching, and I can see, I don't know, say what their bedroom might look like, or just things like that. And then other times with other stories, it's like really feels like making it up as I go along, like really having to like just try and come up with ideas to put in. And I think that's partly where the drafts come in, that you kind of you can add more detail at each time. The more time you spend in that world yourself, the more time you spend with those characters, the more you start to flesh it out. But yeah, I think that's again why it can take a really long time. And like Daniel was saying, you really have to have that muscle that is constantly generating ideas and detail, because you have to have like the really big idea of like what the whole story is, but then you have to have all these tiny ideas as well, like kind of what color is so and so's curtains, and like what number of house are they, and like all of those things you've got to figure out. So yeah, I think it just takes time, and yeah, being willing to do the work to imagine and to create it. Yeah.
But there's also kind of the confidence there that you can create a world and create characters that are believable as well. Because I suppose that's when I write that. I mean, the 50-word things I write are usually just, as I say, often quite surreal or whatever. So that I've got a reasonable imagination for something that's short and surreal. But I think that's one thing I struggle with in writing longer things, because when I've written sort of short stories, as I say, they've usually been based on real incidents and real people and that sort of thing. But there's only so far you can take that idea, isn't there? But writing, I mean, you can draw on aspects of people you knew and aspects of your own experience and things you've seen. But ultimately, if you're going to write novels, you're going to have to be able to create characters and scenes in a world that's going to be believable. And I suppose that must take quite a lot of confidence to do that, to know that you created a character in a world that people, that is going to ring true and people are going to believe in. That wasn't so much.
Yeah, what do you reckon, Daniel?
Well, I really love the whole world building process, and I suppose because I write fantasy or historical fantasy, it's a really huge thing. I don't know if it's more so than if you write stuff set in this world, but it's different. And I love it because it's a play stage before I get onto the work stage, which is the first draft. And I don't know about you, but I really don't like the first draft. I hate it, and I start having fun. I have fun before that when I'm making it all up and saying, "Wouldn't it be cool if this happened?" or "Wouldn't it be cool if this?" Then the fun comes after the first draft when I can polish it and explore out it and actually make it into something someone might want to read. In terms of how build it, I've found recently one technique that's worked really well for me is kind of interviewing myself or have a conversation with myself. So I'd had some ideas for a magic system in my next book. So I just wrote out a question. Okay, there's this magic called spaying. How does that work exactly? Well, I kind of wrote out like a conversation. Oh, that's interesting. But then how does that happen? Well, and somehow in that conversational way, I found it clarified my ideas and new ideas came. Sometimes I had to say, yes, but I don't know. We'll come back to that. And so different techniques, having a dialogue with myself is working well just now. A lot of the time, yes, it's some kind of asking questions. Who was this person's mother? What was she like? How did that affect him? What's their coming of age ritual in this society? And then I really resonate with this idea that it's listening more than making up a lot of the time, at least for me. I read somewhere someone saying a long time ago that writing a novel is like sculpture. Rather than making something up, you're chipping away to reveal the form that's already there within the stone, which is apparently what a sculptor would describe their process as being. And so I just feel more and more all the time like I've just got to pay attention to the character, listen, like if they start with this vague form and then kind of trying things out, like, okay, so he's like this. Is that true? Yeah, okay, yeah, I've got it, okay. And then, no, that's not quite working. And you're coming back and back until you found, it feels like till you found what was already there.
Yeah, I really like what you said with that, Daniel. I like the sculpture analogy, and I also think of it that there's like a domain in which stories exist, and we're tapping into those stories and we're kind of transcribing them down. And yeah, it feels really nice when it feels like what we're doing is, as you say, paying attention or listening, and it's coming to us. And like you say, it's almost like you sort of hear it and it's like, is that right? Is that that what it is? And then you're like, oh no, it's not quite that. It sort of comes into focus. And then, yeah, I think that, but yeah, I think it's really interesting what you're saying, Daniel, about, you know, obviously in your genre, then the world building is a huge part of that, much more than I think in, you know, the other genres that are generally based in reality, and you don't really have to figure out a lot of stuff. You just copy down what's in our own worlds. So I suppose, Stephen, yeah, maybe it's a case of like, yeah, having the, like, whether you have the curiosity to want to create a whole world, but maybe that's just not your bag. Like I always say, you don't have to write a novel, don't bother. Like it's like, it's such hard work. Like if you can, you know, write these brilliant short stories, then that's such a skill, and like, yeah, it's great.
Oh, I must admit, I'm asking because I have been trying to write a novel. So so yeah, that's what I'm trying to get hints on it. It's probably the proverbial novel inside me, because it is like a kind of a largely autobiographical one. So whether there'll be anything left after that, I don't know. But it's interesting hearing what Daniel was saying about the difference between trying to write a fantasy novel and a well, kind of reality novel, I suppose. Because in terms of the different priorities, because I suppose with a fantasy novel, I mean, you're trying to create a world that's believable and characters that are believable, but in a different way than if you're writing in strict reality, I suppose, aren't you? I mean, that they have to make sense within that world, but the actual story itself is in a sense even more important in a fantasy novel than in a reality one. Would that be true? I don't know. That's a fantasy novel, the strength of the story and its ability to grasp people's imagination is huge, I suppose, isn't it? Really, but I think in a reality novel you can possibly get away with not having a great story at all in a reality novel sometimes, but I think in a fantasy one you can't.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I was considering this question earlier of you know, character or plot, what's more important, and I was thinking, well, I suppose I feel like character is kind of generally revered as being the main thing. Like, you know, proper books are more about character, and perhaps more kind of commercial fiction is more plot driven. And so I thought, well, okay, I should be more about character then. I thought, I don't know. I think, well, yeah, when you're writing a fantastical novel, and my stuff, I should mention, is historical fantasy or prehistoric fantasy. It's set in ancient Scotland. I've written some post-apocalyptic as well, also set in Scotland. That world building is such a huge thing, that it is as important as character, I think, and the cultures and the magic systems and other things which you create within that world, they're so inseparable. I don't know how much I could pull them apart.
Yeah.